In this video, I want to explain why you might want to use classes and objects in Python as opposed to other containers that you have. So we know in Python that we have certain containers like dictionaries, lists. There's other containers like sets, tuples. So there's this question of, well, in which situations might it make sense to use classes and objects versus these other containers that I already have available to you? And I'm going to show one common pattern that comes up that leads you sort of in the direction of using classes and objects. Now, first of all, I'd like to say you can go a long way with just using variables, the built-in data structures in Python, and functions. There's not really anything that's necessitating that you have to use classes and objects. So if you just don't understand it or you're just not seeing the value, just feel free to keep using functions, keep using these built-in data types that Python has. Now, I'm going to illustrate this in the way of an example. So I'm first going to show you some SSH code built on Parameco that just uses functions. And I'm going to talk about some of the behavior and some of the patterns that we see. And then I'm going to show you the same code in a class and shows you some of the ways that it helps us. So first of all, let's just look at this SSH code that connects to a network device that's just using functions. So here I jump down to my section where I'm in the main part of this program. This _name is just a technique that you use to divide importable code, which is above this line, from executable code, which is below this line. You can look this up online. It's a well-known pattern in Python. So basically everything I have above this line is either going to be a function, a class, or a constant. So in my case, I just have a bunch of functions above here, some imports and some functions above that line. And then all my executable code is down here. Okay, so we're going to be establishing an SSH connection using Parameco to a remote Cisco device. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to get the password, and then we're going to call this function. So I'm going to call this function that I created, and I just called this function SSH_con. Takes 3 arguments: hostname, username, password. And you look up here and you look at this SSH_con function. It just does a bunch of Parameco glue code to basically establish a Parameco SSH connection to the remote device, and it basically returns that SSH connection here. So we get back down into our code here, and this my_con variable is actually the SSH connection to the remote device. Now, once you have the SSH connection, you're going to want to start doing things with that SSH connection. For example, in this case, I'm actually going to verify that I can read and write the SSH connection, which I do through this verify connection function. I'm also going to disable paging, and then you could envision other functions that you would call. For example, sending some sort of show command and getting the output back, going into config mode, executing a configuration change. So you could see this set of functions that you would build up across time to do various things. Now notice in these 2 functions that I created, the thing that I have to pass in each of these functions is going to be the SSH connection itself. So here for this verify connection, I have to pass in the SSH connection, which makes sense because this verify connection function is going to use that SSH connection. Similarly, the disabling paging function is going to use that SSH connection. So the pattern I would see is all these functions that I would build up would inherently have to have as an argument this SSH connection reference. So we have that here and we're passing it in. Now, if you remember in my earlier discussions, at least I think I said this in earlier videos, that Python objects and classes have this combination of data, attributes, and things you do with the data and attributes, i.e. functions, or in class object terminology, methods. And if you look at this pattern here, you're seeing this combination of data. Also, you could refer to this as shared state. In this case, our data is the SSH connection. So that shared state that we're sharing between all these functions, and we could easily have another, half dozen, or more functions that all need this SSH connection, this shared state, and then the things that we do. And the things that we do are the functions themselves. So here I'm going to verify the connection, i.e., send something down the channel, read it back. Here I'm going to disable the output paging and verify that that's disabled. So we have this combination of things that we do, functions, methods, and shared state. In this case, the shared state is the SSH connection. So if you see yourself passing a common set of attributes between a set of functions, that should be a tip-off, a clue to you that you might want to think about using classes and objects, because that is sort of the most fundamental use case of classes and objects, this combination of shared state, these common attributes, and then the things that we do, the methods and the, so the methods also, you might know those as functions. So shared state and functions. Okay, now let's go ahead and execute that code, and I'll actually show you that that code does in fact operate. This is just executing the function code. Okay, and you see we could talk to this router. You see we disabled output paging. Now let's look at that same code but using classes and objects. Now let's go to the top and just look at our structure. So here our structure is, we have a class, we have an init method. I actually made a new method called open, and the open is where I establish the SSH connection itself, and it basically has that same glue code that you saw in that sshcon function back in the function code. So we establish an SSH connection to the remote device, and then I have methods. I have a verify connection method. I have a disable paging method, and notice here I only have a reference to self. I do not have any reference to the SSH connection as far as an argument. That has already been bound to the object, so I don't need to pass it between these various methods. Similarly, disable paging doesn't have any reference to the SSHcon. That's already been bound to the object. It does have a command, but that's just the command we're going to send down the channel to disable paging. Now, if we look at our code that we use here, you can see that our code that we use here establishes the SSH connection. So it creates an object of this SSHcon type. It then opens the SSH connection, i.e., actually establishes the SSH connection to the device. And then we call our various methods. So verify con, disable paging. Once again, notice there's nothing we had to pass in there. We didn't have to pass in an SSHcon to tell it to do these things. Let's go ahead and execute that, make sure that code also works. And you can see we have converted the function code over to classes and objects code. So when we look at this pattern, we have this pattern where we're passing a whole bunch of common arguments. In this case, it was it was fundamentally this SSHcon, but you could envision a whole bunch of other potentially common attributes in various situations that you might need to pass between functions. And when you see that pattern of shared state and functions, you should start thinking of this might be a use case for when I want to use classes and objects. Now, there's other more advanced uses you can get into, like most notably inheritance. I'll probably do a future video which starts talking about inheritance, but you also don't want to overcomplicate it. So you want to look for the most fundamental use case, and the most fundamental use case is this combination of shared state and things that you do with that shared state.